The first time I played F.E.A.R, I was already well into my days of considering myself immune to horror. I had already long since gotten accustomed to cheap jump scares and gore, and it took more than something that would kill people or worse to get my skin tingling. F.E.A.R taught me that I was wrong. What I had actually gotten accustomed to was the simple and cheap cliches of horror, but not so much clever and sadistic delivery of that same horror. Sure, the game has some familiar imagery that has been seen in other horror stories, especially Asian horror, but it always seems to have a discomforting, subtle twist in F.E.A.R. It doesn't hurt either that the game looks great for its time, and has some of the best gunfights I've ever seen in any shooter to this day. Every bit of the game seems carefully crafted to evoke an incredibly tense experience, with just enough downtime to let the player catch their breath, while also building upon the horror aspects of the story. There are dark corners everywhere, and anything could be watching from the shadows. But F.E.A.R is smart enough not to get carried away with its scares by having them all over the place. Instead, they happen more rarely, which just makes it all the more terrifying when something finally does happen. By the time you finally find yourself standing in one of the game's quite clever scares, you're also a complete nervous wreck. Luckily, the game rarely commits to cheap low blows, such as cheap jump scares. Instead, the scare seems to build around the atmosphere of being constantly stalked by something completely eldritch that for some reason seems drawn to you. When something does happen, it doesn't as much make you jump in your seat as it just sends a merciless and ferocious shiver down your spine.
They left her in darkness. They left her to die.
The game's story is mostly told through voice messages left on phones throughout the campaign.
You have one new message.
It makes a lot of sense considering the largely industrial settings of the game. But standing around listening to voicemail can quickly become a bit boring. Thankfully, the messages are usually just a single sentence or paragraph in length. The writing and voice acting are decent, but the format really makes it hard to build up any sense of chronology of the backstory that you're uncovering. You should be able to build up the general idea of what's happening without much trouble, but the details seem a little more hard to piece together. Also, the characters don't get that much time to shine, but at least they appear mostly believable throughout the ordeal. That is, with the exception of the main villain, who tries so hard to be a creepy badass that it unfortunately comes right back around and hits him in his own cliched face. The story is, in general, also not that original, and there are quite a few cliches throughout. To its credit though, it did handle the explanation of its supernatural elements quite well, by letting us know where it came from, but never making it entirely tangible and logical. In this way, the scary stuff stays scary, and near the end, it only gets scarier. It's just the way a horror story climax should be, and it also has a heavy dose of action elements to connect with the game's shooter format. The story and scares are, however, not the real draws of the game. While they do supply the experience with a unique identity and atmosphere, it's the shooter portion of the game that really sets it apart. The fighting in F.E.A.R is nothing short of masterful. Even to this day, I have yet to experience weaponry feeling this great to use in any other shooter. The amount of dust and debris that bullet impacts kick up are insane, and sometimes rooms get so dense with these particle effects that it becomes difficult to see through. There aren't that many different weapons in the game, but each one feels quite different from the others, and all of them also sound very powerful. You do also have a few melee options, but they feel incredibly floaty and lack any real kick, pun intended. Throughout the campaign, you will also be fighting the same soldier again and again, with only a very few exceptions. Luckily, the AI of F.E.A.R is also some of the best I have ever fought against. In the 10 years it's been since its original release, I have yet to experience AI as clever as this. There are even scientific papers written about this particular AI. If that doesn't speak for itself, then I don't know what does. It doesn't make things any easier that they can also tear away your armor and health in split seconds if you put yourself anywhere near a bad spot. Simply put, these guys do not fuck around. It is, however, worth noting that the AI is undermined by the game's scripting. Practically every single encounter has the enemy soldiers say a few lines before the encounter begins, even if they're setting up an ambush. As smartly as these guys fight, they sure aren't written that cleverly. Although their lines during fights are pretty cool, and even useful to listen out for. If it does happen that these guys put you in a really messy situation, you can put the game in a slow motion mode. It's nothing hugely original, but given the fast-paced action, it works really well. And it looks amazing when you send guys flying through the room in a cloud of dust and blood. Unfortunately, this ability is pretty easy to abuse, and the game becomes pretty easy when you do. Because of this, I really do recommend playing the game on the highest difficulty. Another cool challenge for a bit of replayability is to leave the slow motion key unbound and then play through the game without it. It's actually a surprisingly good time, and it's also very challenging. In order to overcome the game's challenges, you do need to keep your eye out for supplies. There are quite a few nooks and crannies to explore, and it's often worth doing so. The level design around the encounters themselves is also quite good. A lot of times, it's not just a single narrow corridor that you're fighting over. There are flanking options for both you and your enemies, which just makes each encounter demand your full attention that much more. As much as I may praise both the horror and shooting elements of F.E.A.R, it is where the two connect that the game struggles. Unfortunately, the pacing of the game feels all over the place. Sometimes you'll walk around for minutes without anything happening. Other times, the game will creep you out one moment, only to throw you into a relentless gunfight a few seconds later. You'll also be wandering around environments that look quite monotone for long periods of time, and the game doesn't introduce new mechanics or elements after the first few chapters. Luckily, the monotony is broken up by the AI being really good, which means that each fight feels different, even after multiple playthroughs. Honestly though, if you're going looking for flaws in F.E.A.R, you'll quickly find yourselves nitpicking most of the time. There isn't much wrong with any aspect of it, and it's one of the single greatest shooters I have ever played.